I was running Parlophone, which was a small label in England. I've been doing this for about 12 years. In 1962, Brian Epstein walked into my office with a record of this group called the Beatles, which I thought was such a stupid name. So corny with an A. And they weren't very good. It was a funny kind of sound. And I thought, well, if you want me to judge it on this, forget it. I said, but if you bring them down to the studios and I'll have a look at them, see what happens. I was very blasé about it. And they came in, and they came into the studios. And it was like electricity. They had this wonderful atmosphere. They had tremendous charisma. They had no great songs with them, but they gave you the feeling that you felt so good for being with them. Mm-hmm. And when they left, you felt as though something had gone away. I thought, well, if they have this effect on me, they're going to have an effect on everybody else. So I signed them. Simple as that. They've been turned down by every other record company in the country. And when Brian was given my name, he didn't really know much about me. And he said, well, what does George Martin do? He said, well, he makes comedy records. Then he knew he'd hit rock bottom. And I always joke about them saying success never changed them. They always were arrogant little devils. And it's true, because they were very cheeky. The first time, on the very first session, I brought them into the control room because it was a strange sound, and I wasn't quite sure if we were getting the balance right. So I said, come in here and have a listen to it. Now,
Did you think it was strange because it sounded American?
Yeah, well, it was raucous. I mean, up to that time, most of our records have been things like Tommy Steele or Cliff Richard, were kind of fairly anemic versions of Elvis Presley.
Right.
And suddenly we had 4 kids and 3 of them singing together, which wasn't heard of before. So I said, come and have a listen and see what you think. And if there's anything you don't like, tell me. George Harrison looked at me and said, don't like your tie for a start. The other ones clobbered him, saying, hey, wait a minute, you might blow it. Careful, I
was recording a live group of musicians, and the alternative to what I did was to record a mono, all in one channel. Right. The only reason I used the stereo machine in a twin-track form was to make a better mono and to delay the decision of submerging the voices into the background. I wanted to record as quickly as possible and give myself a little bit of leeway in order to determine that vital relationship between voice and backing. That's the only reason I separated them. I didn't separate them for people to hear them separate, and that boomeranged on me. But I wasn't thinking in stereo because in 1962 and 1963, stereo didn't exist as pop records. It existed in classical form, but there were virtually no pop stereo records issued. So why should I worry about stereo when it was miles away?
You can hear sibilance.
Of course, one was worried about it. You knew darn well that what I was hearing in the studio would never be heard in the home. And what we could do about it was limited anyway. We didn't have DSs. We didn't have any kind of technical gimmicks that could help us. And I knew that we would lose a lot of that in the transfer and when it was heard on a little dance-set mono machine.
Paul was always much more interested in music per se, whereas John was always more interested in words per se. And I think this relationship benefited from the ping pong of those things. I mean, I think Paul always wanted to be able to write lyrics like John could do, and John really envied Paul's gift for melody. John once said to me, let's face it, George, I don't expect to walk into a bar in Spain and hear people whistling I'm the Walrus.
Why wasn't that on, the first English album?
Well, because Brian and I, we sort of worked out a game plan once we had a succession of hits. And we said we'd try and do 4 singles a year, maybe a couple of albums a year. But the albums, we would try and give people as good value for money as possible. So we crammed generally about 14 titles onto an album. And the album was completely fresh. No one would ever have heard the stuff before. So we reasoned that if we put a single on the album, we'd be giving people short measure because they already got it.
Right.
So we had this policy of not putting singles on records, on the album.
And Let It Be eventually was issued after Abbey Road, but we weren't to know that at the time. And the idea for Let It Be was a good one, but it never really materialised. The basic idea was that John and Paul and George should write new songs for the album that were going to be really good, and we would vet them and make sure they were good and maybe do demo tracks for them. But the actual album itself, we thought, let's make a live album. We'd never done this. For the first time, let's make a live album of original music before an audience. The idea foundered because we couldn't find anywhere which would take an audience in England in the middle of winter, an audience big enough it was. And as usual, the Beatles wanted to do everything at an hour's notice, and you can't organise these things very quickly. And they also wanted to record in their own studio in Savile Row, which was not equipped properly. So in order to accommodate that, I had to move in a lot of equipment from Abbey Road into their studio, and the designer, Magic Alex, had forgotten to put a hole in the wall for the wires to go through. So, I mean, all this silly kind of thing. And the studio wasn't ideal, but we worked in it.
We had been very unhappy during Let It Be. Let It Be was a miserable experience. And I never thought we would get back together again. And I was quite surprised when Paul rang me up and said, we all want to make another record, will you produce another one for us? And he said, will you really produce it? I said, if I'm really allowed to produce it, I'll really produce it. If I have to go back and accept a lot of instructions which I don't like, then I won't do it. And Paul said, no, we really want you to produce it like you did used to. And once we got back in the studio, it really was nice. The boys tended to record their own items. And in fact, we would work sometimes in different studios at the same time. I would have Chris Thomas working with me and helping out. So I would sort of be dashing from one studio to another. On particular tracks, where more forces were needed, then the other boys would come in. I mean, on Because, for example, very much a John song, but it needed the combined singing of the three men. So obviously it became a joint effort.
Did they ever record as a group?
Oh, they recorded as a group.